Afternoon, everyone. 1:45, so we can resume. We left it sort of mid discussion about a number of things, and we covered fair amounts of ground. And I was wondering, Mr. Elvin, if it might be worth coming to you first. Was there anything the council wanted to say?
Can I just clarify one point? And I appreciate you may regard this as slightly tangential. It related to the issue of the council and the SPD. I've looked at the resolution and spoke to Mr. Ferris, who was at the meeting and who reported. That's right, isn't it? Yes. Two options were offered to the executive. One was to proceed. The SPD was inconsistent with the local plan, and officers recommended not pursuing that because it would interfere with the local plan process potentially. But their recommendation was that the provisions in the local plan were still sound, as I said earlier, and that was the recommendation, option 2, that members accepted. We can provide you with a copy of the resolution and the minutes if it's necessary. You may not think so, but I just wanted for the record to make it clear that those two options were put forward, but that the SPD was inconsistent. And of course, an SPD which is inconsistent with the local plan out of which it's supposed to emerge is unlawful, of course. On the issue of the thresholds, well, you have our position on the thresholds. There is, it's not pepper potting as such, and I gave you my point on that, but the... Yes. Yes, but of course the H8.2 and the 100 metres either side criterion does effectively allow for a distribution in terms of location. And of course, if the areas closest to the university already meet the thresholds in that policy, then of course they will have to. If HMOs are to be sought, they will have to be elsewhere. That's a consequence of having a policy which prohibits over-concentration of HMOs in a particular location, which also deals with the question of streets being abandoned at certain times of the year because there's no student population. Of course, the position in the past has been there has been no statutory development plan policy which requires it. Is there anything else you want me to add? No, that's it for the moment. Thank you.
That's helpful, Mr. Elvin. Mr. Tucker, I was going to ask you. You've been obviously listening to this conversation about restrictions on HMOs and the like. Does the university or universities have a view on this? Is there an if you restrict HMOs, does that have an impact on the way the university approaches student accommodation, for example?
Yes is the answer. It's all bound up with our representations that there needs to be a strategy about the extent to which the authority is looking to restrict HMOs, and particularly with mindful of York St John's and the nature of their student body, there is a serious concern that doing that would then result in increased pressure for PBSA, which then becomes unaffordable, and it becomes a vicious cycle. So an approach which is led by identifying what the actual needs are and then the consequence of approaching the policy is what we think is needed, and that's what's lacking evidentially. There is an arbitrary nature to the approach that's being taken. There's also an underpinning observation that HMOs are necessarily objectionable. All HMOs give rise to adverse effects, and that's just not something that we accept, and that Mr. Coakley explained the reason for that before lunch. And so do the universities have a view in relation to it? Yes, they do. A restrictive approach would increase need for other provision to be made, and it particularly affects York St John's in that regard.
And if I might just reinforce the point that was made earlier, HMOs are not just dealing with university students. Let us not forget nurses and other similar professions who cannot afford single dwellings. Speaking as the brother of a New York nurse.
Declaring an interest. Councillor Waters.
Thank you, sir. Just going back to what council said earlier about this business of the council motion going in front of executive. You can dress it up any way you want. Executive will quite clearly, I won't say the word threatened, advised that to follow through with the council motion would put the local plan in jeopardy. That is the basis upon which that decision was made. Not because they think that the policy is sound, because they were frightened, for political reasons, of the local plan failing.
Councillor Waters is only reading half of what was in front of the executive. I'm going to put it in the examination library, so there's no doubt. The problem, as I said, is the SPD was in conflict with the local plan. And obviously, it would create problems if it had been adopted inconsistent with the local plan policies. I don't dispute that for a moment, but what the councillor ignores is, firstly, these were officer recommendations, and the second option was that the policy was sound and that members should proceed with it. But you can't ignore the fact that you're putting forward an SPD which is inconsistent with your local plan.
I don't want to get too diverted into this because it's not really something.
No.
It's not really something we can address. What we're interested in is the workings of the policy, not necessarily how we've got here.
I certainly don't want to bog you down, but it just needs to be repeated again that the SPD came first before the policy was ever written. The SPD actually is the policy. That is the timeline of this process.
I understand.
And the only thing that I would add to that is that if the council wished to have a policy that was different in terms of the thresholds or anything else from the one that's currently proposed, then that would be a matter for it to put forward a proposed main modification.
Ms Hilton.
Thank you. I wondered if it's okay to broaden the conversation back out to student accommodation more generally than HMOs. I wouldn't want anyone to think that we blame students in any way for bad behaviour. Some of us have been young and rowdy at times. And also, people might think, well, it's your own silly faults for moving into a student area. So I just wanted to think about what happens which makes living amongst students more difficult or could be made less difficult. Obviously, my colleague here, John Garner, he said he moved into Haslington 20 plus years ago. I'm a more recent resident and I don't actually live in the village. But there have been changes to student accommodation, purpose-built student accommodation, and probably the number of HMOs, which have made a difference. And also, of course, we've had a whole new Campus East built in that time. And the other change has been these night buses that Mr. Garner referred to. So, starting with the purpose-built student accommodation, Halifax Hall, which, as I said, well, in theory, it's actually built on the campus, but on the ground, in actual reality, it's in the village. And it's through the village, and the students have to pass through the village to get to and from the hall. And at the time that it was commissioned, it was for married students and postgraduate students, and that's who used it first. Obviously, that's a very, very different population from freshers. I'm not quite sure of exactly the balance living in it now, but it is predominantly undergraduates. And that has made an enormous difference to the loss of amenity for the residents. The next thing that changed was I'm not quite sure of the order, but I think it was the Campus East development next, although there hasn't been so much PBSA built on there yet, but that's in the process of appearing now. And obviously that meant that students were traversing through the village between the two campuses, or between Campus East and the sports fields. And then the next change that happened was the night buses, which have brought about an enormous problem for residents. Before that, students would go out for the night by taxi and return by taxi door to door. But now, of course, they get off at the bus stop and wander through the village, or they wander through the village to go out, having preloaded in their rooms or at the pub. Drunk before they go out, in case you're not familiar. So this obviously has been 3 big changes. The inhabitants of the PBSA, the building of Campus East, and also transport, which I'm not exactly sure if the night buses were started and made much more frequent every 35 minutes through the night, in order to perhaps have a duty of care to students, for students' well-being. But the end result is there's no duty of care to the neighbours. And that's the sort of thing which I think perhaps is preventable at a planning stage if there was some kind of criteria in there where the local community needed to be involved in the initial planning decisions and then in any kind of a change. Now, I don't think there's anything in the local plan which gets down to that level of detail, but we need something to protect the residents of York. Because if it's happening in Heslington, I'm sure it will happen elsewhere as well.
Thank you. Mr. Merritt, I'll come to you next.
Thank you very much. Just wanted to pick up 2 points. One from earlier, which I had my card up but didn't spot it. So first of all, if I could just respond to Mr. Elvin's comment just now about the other HMO function, which I flagged when I was speaking earlier. I was careful to choose my words in terms of the comment I made about HMOs now being overwhelmingly student. The reality is, because of the escalation of prices, rents in particular, actually there are very few of the HMOs left that used to serve, low-income median workers left, because, commercially for the landlords, they can now get much higher income groups occupying the premises. So, that other HMO function is a much, much lower level than it used to be. And again, it raises the issue of how do you address housing accommodation for that section of the population on low and middling incomes who want HMO type accommodation when it's all in effect being driven commercially to the student end of the market or high income professionals. It's a real challenge. So that's why we need to have much more affordable housing and a decent range that can cater. Second issue, as I say, coming back to earlier, when Miss Bartle responded for the council after the first break, she was making the point in terms of the student housing that the figure of 539 for the continuing provision was a relatively small one in terms of the overall picture. As I say, I'd come back to the point that the evidence of the first few years of this plan is that the student growth has been far, far higher. And we do have the university's current evidence, as opposed to the evidence that was in the base plan, saying that they're anticipating 4% growth potentially over the whole of the rest of the plan period. So 539 will certainly not necessarily be the real figure. And as I say, I think that in fact reinforces the point I made about having a monitoring and managing arrangement and clear recording of treatment of student housing needs as a separate category in the evidence base and in the plan. And if the council is going to come, and you're going to come back to this in September, that might perhaps give the council the opportunity to look at how it can more strategically handle these issues than the current plan and evidence base do.
Thank you, Mr. Merritt. Councillor Waters.
Thank you, sir. I don't really want to get involved in bringing up the adverse effects of the student housing on the communities I represent or what Councillor Pavlovich represents. I brought plenty of ammunition, but I don't honestly think it's going to help matters. What I do think is going to help matters is what Inspector Berkeley said just a few minutes ago, that this could be treated as a main modification. And bearing in mind that the other student issue, or the university issue, will be discussed in September, it would be nice to think that the council would work at enacting the will of the elected members of the council and bringing forward a main modification that looked at reducing these thresholds by half in the supplementary planning document, and, as was asked, to go away and look at how these policies are applied, best practice virtually, from other local authorities, because what I'd certainly like to see is something getting very detailed whereby no two adjacent properties in a street could be HMOs. And I also think part of best practice, you'd look at Leeds Council whereby there's consideration of streets, and again, I'm mentioning Syward Street. I've been reliably informed at the lunch break that that is now 75% HMOs, that there was some detail in the policy whereby, I hesitate to use the word that you're abandoning those streets to the fate, but you're providing a way out for people that somehow find one of these properties, because in a lot of cases it's elderly residents that's living there that leave the properties to somebody else, and what do they do with them? Nobody really wants to, no families want to start off living up there, so they're stuck with them, and that's where the Leeds policy offers that flexibility to go above quite a high threshold. Again, it's a figure that would need to be decided, but probably 50%, and you would think that the street has overbalanced into its fate, basically. But I think this, what you said, offers a way forward and a way out of this for the council, and that's to come up with a main modification for September.
Of course, we'd be happy to consider that, but I have to leave that matter with the council in the first instance to reflect on. I'm sure it's not something that they could put forward now, but yeah, when we come back in September and talk about the University of York in particular, we will be inevitably covering some of this ground again, but I hope not all of it. Mr. Coakley.
Thank you. I wanted to speak to the point that I raised earlier about the link between HMOs and PBSA, specifically some of the evidence that I referred to earlier. I feel duty-bound, first of all, just to make the point that I think we are dwelling far too much in sometimes buried in hyperbole around the negative impacts of students in particular. And you only need to look at some of the fantastic contributions in the Groves with our students on Bishopthorpe Road, both areas with high HMO percentages and high numbers of students. Those communities are made by the presence students there and the positive contributions they make. So I do think it needs to be a balanced approach to consideration of community makeup. In relation to our own interface directly with HMOs, we expect to have not far short of 200 students placed directly within HMOs for the next academic year, often based on particular needs that have been identified by prospective students, which mean that there's a greater duty of care assumed and placed on the university to cater for their particular needs. Those HMOs are typically lower quality than the purpose-built accommodation that we would provide ourselves. They are less energy efficient and poorer quality in terms of aspects like fire safety. So we need a lot more work to verify and satisfy ourselves that we're fulfilling our obligations to our students in that respect. But they are lower cost, and which brings me back to my earlier point around affordable PBSA. If there was a much greater amount of PBSA coming through the system, which was at a reasonable price for our students, then we would immediately move away from all of those HMOs. But the critical point is, it wouldn't be appropriate, because of the needs that I've just mentioned, it wouldn't be appropriate for us to be placing those students spread across the city. All of those HMOs are in the immediate vicinity of York St John for obvious reasons. Some based around disability, some anxiety, other mental health issues. So I take issue with the assumption that the whole of York could theoretically be accessible when you look at the price of bus fares, for example, in relation to other cities. It simply isn't accessible in the mentality of a student with a limited fixed income, which is shrinking. So the logical implication of that is what we have identified in our representation, that we think there should be flexibility to allow higher percentages of HMOs local to the areas where logic would dictate that that's where you would expect them to be, and a greater acknowledgement of the positive contributions that could make to the community as well.
Thank you. I'll come back to the council at this stage, whether there's anything you need to add. I think there's a couple of questions that we wanted to touch on.
I don't think there's anything we want to add specifically, but obviously,
okay.
Any other points you have for us?
I think the first question, and forgive me, is quite a general one, but is there a specific policy in the plan which deals with how you approach an application for PBSA? Is that H7, or is this and with DC policies, or is it something else?
It's normal DC policies plus H7, and I've already been giving some thought as to how a modification to H7 might be appropriately put forward, which deals with the issues that were raised this morning, including a contribution to an off-site contribution for affordable housing, since it's taking up land that might otherwise be occupied by market housing, not on campus, because that's not doing that. And secondly, to deal with the affordability issue in terms of student accommodation, adapting what's in the London plan, because that then leaves it, if the PBAs have to have a nomination agreement or agreements in place, that leaves it to them to resolve with the higher education providers what the terms of the nomination agreement are, and that can all be hived off to those negotiations, because those providers will know what the position is with their students, and it will avoid difficult issues of determining what affordability means in student terms.
So just so I'm...
So H7 will become much more a much more focused policy.
Just so I'm clear on that point, Mr. Elvin, I think what you're saying is some sort of clause that requires the nomination agreement to be in place, and that agreement itself will cover the low rent issue.
If the PBAs want to get planning permission, they will have to have nomination agreements from the higher education providers, and it will then be a matter for negotiation by the universities and other higher education providers as to what those terms are going to be. And as I say, they are better placed to know what is needed in terms of their students than the council is. And that will overcome any difficulties having to formulate something. And it will leave it to them, with their knowledge, to resolve what the terms of the nominations are going to be. And the PBAs will have to have the nominations in place in order to get their planning permission.
That sounds quite encouraging. I'd just flag one issue that came out of what was said earlier. Obviously, you have the two universities tend to represent different social demographic groups and income. And the issue of the University of York potentially outbidding St John's for sites, would it be possible that the policy specifically makes reference to ensuring that the agreements do adequately cover for low income students and special needs students, just the principle, and then obviously the detail for the negotiation?
I don't think we can go too far to constrain market negotiations effectively, but it may be possible to put in some general words, and we'll give some thought to that, Mr. Merritt. We will.
Just to say, we strongly welcome the observation on the City Council. That places us, by which I don't just mean York St John, but specifically York St John here this afternoon, in a very much stronger position to ensure that if somebody is running a case to get student accommodation on the back of need generated in the city by virtue of York St John, then they are then held to the requirement to ensure that students from York St John can go. And they can't be gazumped by wealthy international students going to the university. And I should perhaps, I don't hold a brief for them, but the same would be true for York College and any other tertiary education body. So yeah, strongly endorse that. Thank you.
Excellent. That's very helpful. Thank you.
I would expect to run a draft of any proposed modification past the three higher education providers who've been making representations on this issue.
Thank you.
Can I just ask, is that something that you personally are going to be involved in, Mr. Elvin? That's reassuring.
Mr. Tucker and I have already taken in hand what you asked us to do ourselves yesterday.
Grateful. Thank you both.
Thank you, sir.
There was only one other question I had then, and it was about going back to the allocation SH1 that we touched on. Well, we spoke about this morning, touched on a bit doesn't really reflect what we did, we talked about it, but and it was by way of comparing how the council have approached housing allocations that aren't strategic, and you've got these listed in the plan, but what you've done there is you've specified the site size, and not so concerned about that, but you have stated in there what you estimate the yield to be from that site. And I simply wonder whether it would be useful for a conversation to take place so that there is an estimated yield for SH1 in policy ED5.
I thought we'd already agreed to do that.
And equally, I think it would be right and proper to include that site in the H1 policy with the table 5.2, I think it might be, which lists all of the sites, really an omission that it's not in there as it's part of the housing supply.
We would welcome that proposal, but we would ask that the entire site, which includes the portion of land adjacent, is also included within that allocation.
We'll have that conversation.
That's what I would suggest. Yes. Good. Councillor Pavlovic.
Thank you. I mean, this is really interesting and really encouraging, frankly, to hear these concessions that are being put forward. I mean, the one observation I'd make that is, if this could be incorporated into H7 and it be firmed up, it may have a consequence which would impact on the numbers of HMOs, as we've heard, but also on the viability of PBSA as well, if a proportion of them had to be at low rent. So I think it's kind of a win-win-win for the city potentially.
I think one makes the suggestion about those points because we have touched on the fact that there are other influences at play here on the number of HMOs that might want to come forward, and I have in mind that there is a need for some sort of balance between on-campus accommodation and off-campus, because if you restrict off-campus too much, then you're putting pressure for on-campus, which has its own impacts. That's my thought.
But as well as that, I think what it could do in respect of the HMO market is that it then frees them up. And the point I think about student nurses, for example, and the other types of professionals that may be taking HMOs, which, as I say, do make a valuable contribution to the city, is they're likely to be there year-round, as opposed to term time with long gaps during the summer. So I think they're kind of different kettle of fish, which have much less consequences or adverse consequences, if there were to be any adverse consequences.
Thank you, Councillor Pavlovic. Mr. Merritt, was there something you wanted to add?
If we are at the very end, I just wanted to ask, I made a request on Monday, as does Mr. Keogh, about being able to make some written comments on all the documentation that came out on Friday, given the limited amount of time we had to process it. I don't know whether you've had time to consider.
I don't think we've reached a final point on that yet, but yeah, the opportunity will be there for us to come back to that next week.
Thank you.
We're going to think about that, but our general approach, just so the council is aware, is we do tend to be reasonably cautious when it comes to questions of fairness, which is in effect what's being raised here.
Good.
Excuse me, I'll go to work. Excuse me, I'll go to work.
Okay, well done. Is there anything else we need to discuss under this matter? Councillor Waters.
Thank you, sir. We seem to have reached an end point, or a rapidly approaching end point. I just don't want to leave H8 and any potential main modification from the council just hanging there. I note what Mr. Elvin said on H7 and modifications. I didn't know what his thoughts were on providing an update as to any potential H8 modification, whether that will be done in writing, whether that will be done subsequent sessions next week, whether we as councillors need to push that issue with the relevant corporate director and through the council machinery. I just didn't want to leave it hanging. I just wanted some form of clarification, please.
I understand.
All I was going to say is we aren't going to put forward modifications to H8, and we will leave it to you to determine whether or not you think we need to make the plan sound. We aren't of the same view as the councillor, as you've heard. and it's a matter for you to decide on the evidence you've got what you think the appropriate course of action should be.
Go on.
I have to say, when we're trying to be helpful, that's very, very disappointing. I hope Mr Elvin's not just trying to portray that as my view. It's the view of the whole elected membership of the City of York Council, and to try to push this forward in this manner when the elected membership of the council clearly don't see that policy H8 or the supplementary planning document that virtually pushes that forward aren't sound.
I think what Mr Irvine is saying is that he doesn't currently have any instruction, because he acts on behalf of the council under their instruction. He doesn't currently have any instruction to put forward any main modification in relation to H8. But of course, you have a role within the council, as do others, Councillor Pavlovich, and if you wish to press that through the council's internal machinery, then that's a matter for you. You can, of course, do that.
That's very helpful, sir, and the reason I've got a tie on today is that there's a full council meeting tonight, so whether I or Councillor Pavlovich manage to ask a question on those lines, we will try. Thank you.
I think that's probably best left to see what happens in the background. We, of course, would, if something was to come forward to us, you've already made some suggestions in the course of the hearing today. We will, of course, consider those. But as things stand, it's with us. But if something was to come forward, then, of course, we would consider it. Is there anything else we have to deal with this afternoon, then? No? In which case, thank you all. See you on Tuesday, isn't it, for the next matter?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
When I gather we're going to be labouring under much hotter weather than we had this week. That's Bermuda shorts time again.
Shorts might be allowed. We won't be frowning on them next week if people want to. Not me, though. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, thanks, everyone.